It is still the industry standard, folks. It is Steele's college football preview 24. I've got it right here. I reference it every day. It's right here. It's the only magazine I've got on the desk for all the live shows and all the videos here. And we've got Phil Steele joining us for another offseason here at the Voice of College Football. Phil, how you doing today?
You know, I am doing great, Mark. How about yourself?
I am doing just fine. And folks, this has been the most accurate publication for 29 years. And as soon as you jump to, well, that was 29 years. No, for the last 5 years, for the last 12 years, the most accurate. So consistently putting out the best content and then also the most accurate projections for each and every college football season. All right, Phil, let's get right into it. So I'm going to let you know some things that stand out to me. The power poll versus the preseason top 40, just to explain to everyone, the power rankings are who the best teams are in the country ranked in order. Then you put that together with the schedule and you get a top 40. Everyone's talking about how brutal this Florida schedule is. It is the toughest in college football. So you rank them as number 19 in the power poll, number 48 when it's all put together. Do you remember a time when there was a team that had that much of a disparity because of the schedule dragging them down?
I would have to say, Mark, that it's got to be close to the top. Not quite sure going back all 30 years trying to figure it out, but yeah, that's a big jump or a big difference. Another one would be Oklahoma, number 7 and number 20. As far as it, and it's based on the schedule. But I agree with you. It's a good point on your part.
Another thing here we talk about a lot here with all the changes across college football. We got 13 new teams playing in different conferences just in the power conferences this year. Is that transition that group of 5 teams need to make as a program? And UCF, Houston, BYU, and Cincinnati, 8 and 28 in the Big 12 with a lot of lopsided losses. Utah, TCU, excellent programs, but it took them a couple of years to adjust to power conference play. SMU could break the trend. Now, they did go 0-3 against power conference teams last year, but talk a little bit about SMU without Clemson, North Carolina State, and Virginia Tech on the schedule.
Yeah, and I agree with you 100% there, Mark. In fact, you go back to last year's Big 12, and I looked at teams like BYU, Houston. Both of them were very inexperienced last year, and I didn't think well prepared for the step up to the Big 12 and the depth. Same thing with Cincinnati. They were number 128 on my experience chart heading into last year, had a brand new quarterback. UCF was the only one that came in with a modicum of experience, and they did okay. They got to a bowl game last year. Now, SMU is a completely different animal this year. They come in loaded and ready to play, I think, for the step up. When you look at them, they've got 2 quarterbacks. In fact, just watch the ACC Media Days, and they actually brought both quarterbacks to the ACC Media Days. You ever recall that happening before, Mark?
I don't recall. There's something that tells me that it's happened before. I think it has, but I'm not coming up with the year that would have happened, but it is definitely a rarity. Phil, I'm going to stay on you mentioned UCF and mentioning quarterbacks. I don't know that KJ Jefferson has gotten the kind of credit that he deserves. Those back-to-back seasons with Arkansas in 2021, 2022, 42-9 touchdown to pick ratio. You put him together with Gus Malzahn, who's one of the best offensive minds in the game, RJ Harvey at running back. This is an intriguing team, and if nothing else, they're going to be a whole lot of fun to watch.
Yeah, and let me finish up on that SMU for a minute because
Sure.
I just wanted to touch on them. They're number 7 on my experience chart this year. So they are an experienced team. And as you correctly pointed out, they've got a really nice schedule for ACC play. In fact, I rate it the 4th easiest schedule in the ACC. They get Florida State at home, which I think is going to be the key game as to whether or not they are a contender. But they avoid most of the big boys this year. So I do think SMU steps in their first year and is a clear-cut contender. Now, with UCF, we're looking at KJ Jefferson, and the comparison consistently is Cam Newton, because you remember Gus Malzahn had a quarterback, Cam Newton, at Auburn, and Jefferson's a big boy who was never really 100% last year. And in the games he played, it sort of looked like it. But prior to that, he was one of the better quarterbacks. They've got RJ Harvey at running back. And I tell you what, Gus brought in a ton of transfers. So this is a UCF team that I think is poised to make a big jump in the Big 12 this year.
If you have yet to get Phil Steele's magazine, folks, it is just a must for hardcore college football fans. It's like 3 inches thick, and it could be 10 times that large if it was written in a standard form. But it's a key that you've got to learn because the packed in information is just phenomenal. And Phil gets together with just about every FBS coach to help give that added layer of knowledge and context to each situation across college football. Phil, getting to the Big Ten, of course, with the expanded college football playoff, one beneficiary of that, well, Penn State would be the classic one. They would have made 6 playoffs in the last 10 years. But I'm looking at Iowa, and of course, the defense is exceptional. You've got them ranked number 13, number 1, and 5 at the units, defensive line, linebacker, and defensive backs. And now with a new offensive coordinator in Tim Lester, who has done a fine job, of course, at Central Michigan and in the NFL. One note that I found interesting is that no quarterback at Iowa has completed more than 60% of his passes since 2015, of course, the Rose Bowl season against Stanford. But they bring in, whether it's going to be Cade McNamara, of course, with 1 year in the program, or Brendan Sullivan, who's got 200 pass attempts as a Big Ten quarterback at 69%. So if they just have capable quarterback play and do a few more twists and turns on offense and maybe tweak the offense, maybe they have a breakthrough.
Yeah, I think Tim Lester's going to come out looking pretty good at the end of the season, and he steps into a really good situation. Last year, Cade McNamara was supposed to be the starting quarterback, but he was never 100% heading into the year. He missed a lot of practice time, and when he did play, he then got injured early in the year. They ended up going to Deacon Hill, who, bless his soul, completed less than 50% of his passes, had negative ratio, and teams could stack the box on him. Well, this year they've got a veteran offensive line with all 5 starters back. In fact, it's the best offensive line they've had there in probably 5 years. They've got 2 veteran running backs in LaShawn Williams and Caleb Johnson. Last year, not only did McNamara go down, but their top 2 receivers are both their top 2 tight ends last year, Eric All and Luke Lachey, and both got injured last year. So, they lost their top 2 receivers. They lose their quarterback. Now this year they've got, as you mentioned, 2 quarterbacks that can play, veteran offensive line, improved receiving core, solid running backs. Now I'm not saying I was going to have a potent, one of the most potent offenses in the country, but just an average offense to go along with one of the best defenses and one of the best special teams. Some guy, Kirk Ferentz, is the head coach. Mark, I've got him an underdog in 1 game this year at Ohio State. And I can't believe the Vegas over-under is 7.5 on these guys.
I'm right there with you. They were the first one that jumped out to me right off the page and hit me right in the face looking at over and under win totals. And that's kind of difficult to do because Vegas usually has that pretty well buttoned up, but I can't imagine 7.5 for Iowa. I'm going to stay close to home there with Nebraska. Dylan Raiola, how do you go about your prep work in trying to rate and project a quarterback that's obviously not stepped on the field, but nobody would question the skill set and the arm talent?
Yeah, I tell you what, he'd sure look good in the spring game, but you don't want to overreact to that. The spring game's loaded so he has success, but Dylan Raiola is a guy who is much sought after. Of course, was originally going to go to, I believe, Georgia, and then ended up in Nebraska. He's got the Nebraska heritage. He was my number 2 rated quarterback coming out of high school. He's a guy that sees it. He's got a great feel for everything. He's more mature than your typical true freshman. He's got a big arm. He's got all the arm talent in the world. And he sure looked good when the lights came on in the spring game in front of a pretty good crowd. And he's got a good supporting cast as well. If Nebraska can ever get over those close losses, and it's really struggled with them in the last 3 or 4 years, they could be a dangerous team. And I think he helps that because last year the quarterbacks had a negative ratio, but they also fumbled the ball a lot. I think Raiola, if he eliminates those turnovers, and last year Nebraska was minus 17 in turnovers, all of a sudden with their defense, which last year only allowed 304 yards per game, this is a team that's going to surprise a lot of folks. They are my number 2 most improved team in the country.
Absolutely. And you went a direction that I was going to follow up with. Last four games of the season look like classic Nebraska over the last 6 or 7 years. It looked like Scott Frost was still on the sideline as, they blew games right at the end. The Iowa one was ridiculous in that they intercept a pass at midfield. They're about 10 yards from the game-winning field goal, and they throw it right back to Iowa the very next play. Yeah, I know it's a statistic in baseball that's proven fairly accurate that if you suffer a ton of one run losses or the beneficiary, it tends to swing the other way the next year. Is there any kind of luck factor or further evaluation of play beyond, of course, the wins and losses and the point differential from a previous year where Nebraska would seem to fall into this category?
Yeah, I mean, Nebraska falls in all the categories. The first metric article I wrote for the magazine was the first magazine, 1995, and it was turnovers equals turnaround. And I had done about 4 years of research when I wrote that article, and it said basically 75% of the time, if a team had negative double-digit turnovers, they'd had a better record the next year, and vice versa. If you benefited from positive double-digit turnovers, you had a worse record the next year. Well, guess what? It's held true to form each and every year for 30 years. So I started developing more and more metrics like you touched on, close wins, close losses. And I say these things have a success rate of 75, 80%. That does mean that there's going to be 20% or 10% of the teams that don't do it. Nebraska's killing that, my close wins, close losses category, because they're the one team that keeps having these close losses and doesn't improve the next year. I think that all stops this year with Matt Rule's second season. But yeah, the close wins, close losses article has always done great in the magazine since I put it in. And it actually has about a 76% success rate, except for that doggone Nebraska team, which is ruining the metric.
But you mentioned the key factor there. Second season, Matt Rule, Temple, Baylor, we all know the deal. So maybe he pulls it off at Nebraska this year and they improve decidedly. I've got a statistic for you, Phil. I started to notice about 7 or 8 years ago that with a lot of the preseason publications, that they were extremely conservative in their projections, meaning that they were selecting basically the same record or maybe just a one-game difference from the previous season. And so I thought, well, how often does a team have a significant increase or decrease in losses? So I set 3 as the bar as being the difference between, a significant change. 6-6 team becomes a 9-3 team or a 3-9 team the next year, for example. And I've tracked this now for 7 or 8 years. 26 teams last year out of the 70 Power 5 teams, 26 had a plus or minus difference in wins the previous season of at least 3. And that's pretty consistent. It's usually in the 18 to 22 range. So I think it's a larger portion of college football teams that undergo change from year to year than we think about the sport being kind of static, but it's really only static at the elite level.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There is often drastic change. And, we've seen teams go from first place to last place and last place to first place. And that's the thing about college football. There's even a bigger difference, Mark, if you ever get the time to look at it, in the FCS. The FCS actually has an even higher percentage, which figures because, you've got more turnover on the roster. But, yeah, I would agree. That's a pretty significant number, and I appreciate you sharing that with me.
30 years in running, Phil Steele's college football preview. You got to get it. Phil, what's the best way to do that?
We used to be all over the place, Mark, but I found the most efficient way to do it is we've limited the places where available, and it's allowed for better efficiency. So they're available at Barnes & Noble and Books A Million. Those are the only 2 brick and mortar stores you can go to and get a magazine. Don't go to Walmart. Don't go to the grocery stores. Barnes & Noble and Books A Million are the 2 brick and mortar stores, or you can order it online at philsteele.com. And the interesting thing there is I am going to charge you shipping. I mean, it cost me $10 to ship out the magazine. I'm going to charge you $10 to ship it. But when you do order the hard copy through philsteele.com, we give you the digital magazine for free. And we actually update the digital all the way through the start of the season. Give you an example. Fresno State and Utah State both have had coaching changes since my magazine went to the press. We've got that covered in the digital magazine. So Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, or philsteele.com.
I've got my digital copy always handy, always handy. Based on your unit rankings, Phil, it appears as though you believe Miami's got the best talent, the best roster in the conference, probably the best quarterback as well, and a slight edge over Florida State and Clemson.
Yeah, I think that, I've got number 10 in my power poll. I've got Florida State number 14 and Clemson number 13. Very slight edge. I've tied them all for first, even though Miami's got the best schedule of the group, partially due to the fact that Miami's always seems to disappoint lately. So I was a little leery of that. But I think when you take a look at the talent schedule, I mean, their offensive line, Mark, you got to watch these guys this year. The smallest guy is 6'5", 300 pounds. Everybody else is massive, 6'6", 6'7". They're huge on the offensive line. They've got Cam Ward coming in at QB. And then I thought the weakness after watching the spring game is running back. So what does Cristobal do? He brings in Damian Martinez from Oregon State. Wow, that's a big pickup there. A lot of talent he's been accumulating. I like the talent he built up at Oregon, and he's doing the same thing here at Miami.
Martinez and Mark Fletcher could form one of the best combinations of running backs in college football this year. Phil, one of the teams that I can't get a handle on, not that they're not full of talent, but whether they're going to have a really good breakthrough season would be LSU. Lose a Heisman Trophy winning quarterback. They have no proven running game. That all came from Jaden Daniels last year. The defense was horrific compared to LSU, compared to any standard, but especially LSU standards. You would think it would be nearly impossible to have that type of defensive performance, and it doesn't appear as though they've really worked on the secondary. They did go into the transfer portal. And Brian Kelly, I've got a ton of trust in him, but I'm a bit leery about thinking that they're going to have a really big year.
Yeah, I would agree with you there, Mark. And in fact, I think you're going to see a different LSU team this year. I'll give you an example. The last time they had a Heisman Trophy winner, they averaged 48.4 points per game. That was with Joe Burrow. The next year, they dropped down all the way to 32 points per game, a drop off of 16 points per game. You talk about teams that have a much different from the previous year. They were, but defensively, I think they're going to be improved. Last year, they allowed 28 points per game. This year, I think they might cut that to like 22, 21. Much better defensively. However, offensively with less QB runs, I look for more running back runs. Last year, the running backs ran the ball a total of 280 times. This year, I look for about 375, about 100 carries more from the running backs. Nussmeier will be more of a pocket passer this year. I do expect a drop off of 7 points per game offensively, but an improvement of 7 points per game defensively. A lot of close games this year at South Carolina, at Arkansas, at A&M, at Florida. Those are 4 tough tests on the road. They get Oklahoma at home, Alabama at home, Ole Miss at home. If they don't take care of business against the big boys at home, then it could be a tough year. But in the same token, it's a schedule where if they do take care of business on the road and beat those teams at home, they could be in the SEC title game. A little bit of a wild card for me this year with LSU, but I picked them 5th overall.
And Phil, that's one of the places where I just shake my head repeatedly in going through your magazine is those points per game and yardage total projections that seem to come within fractions of the point total or the yardage total. It's remarkable how close you are on most of those.
Yeah, it amazes me, Mark. And what I do every year is when the first thing I write the offense, I'm like, I'm hoping, and I flip back and I see what my computer projected, and I see, and I'm like, oh my God, it's almost a complete match. I love it, and it just makes me really happy during magazine writing time.
Well, you certainly put enough work into it, you and your staff, and it definitely pays off as the industry standard. Phil Steele's college football preview. You got to get in. And by the way, Phil, congratulations to your daughter on her recent graduation. You saw that in the magazine.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's going to be a little tough with her going off to college, but you know what? Just a joy in my life. I'll tell you that much.
Well, Phil, I know it's a whirlwind after you get this thing completed with all these media stops. So we thank you so much for taking the time for us.
Hey, Mark, I always enjoy doing it. We should do it more often. Talk about some more teams.
Absolutely. We will do that. I'll be reaching out here soon.
All right. Thanks, Mark. Great talking to you again, my friend.